The day my wife, Sarah, told me she wanted a divorce, she also got promoted to senior director. And the weirdest part? It wasn't that she was leaving me. It was how utterly calm she looked when she said it. Like she was closing a business deal she'd been planning for months, just checking another box. We'd been married for 8 years, together for 10. And I genuinely thought we were happy. Or, at least, I thought I was happy. Looking back now, that might have been the whole problem. My name's Kevin, but most people call me Kev. I'm a high school history teacher, the kind of guy who gets genuinely excited explaining the Treaty of Versailles to teenagers who'd rather be on their phones. Sarah, on the other hand, was corporate marketing personified. She climbed that ladder like her life depended on it. When we first met, she was an intern making coffee runs, and I was finishing my teaching degree. We used to joke that we'd both end up broke, but at least we'd be broke together. That, obviously, didn't happen. Sarah got promoted 3 times in 5 years. Suddenly, we went from splitting rent on a cramped apartment to her talking about investment portfolios and networking events I didn't even understand. And I supported all of it. Every late night, every weekend she spent at the office instead of with me. Every time she came home exhausted, and I'd already made dinner because I knew she wouldn't have time. I believed in her more than she believed in herself back then. I'm not saying that to make myself sound like some kind of saint, I'm saying it because it's true, and it makes what happened next even more confusing. This promotion came with a massive pay raise. Sarah was suddenly making twice what I made, maybe more. When she told me, I was genuinely thrilled for her. I took her out to dinner. We celebrated. I told everyone at school my wife was absolutely crushing it in the corporate world. For about 2 weeks, everything seemed fine. Then I started noticing little things. Like how she'd correct me when I used the wrong business term, or how she'd check her phone during conversations and not even pretend to be listening anymore. We used to talk about everything, stupid stuff like what movie to watch, or deep stuff about whether we wanted kids someday. But suddenly, all her stories were about people I'd never met, deals I didn't understand, and this whole world she was living in that just didn't include me. I'd tell her about my day, the kid who finally understood the Cold War, or the funny thing that happened in the teacher's lounge. And she'd smile, this polite, distant smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The same smile, I'm sure, she gave to boring people at conferences. It felt like I was slowly becoming a stranger in my own marriage, except I was the only one who noticed. The comments started small, so small I almost didn't catch them at first. Sarah would say things like, "Must be nice to have summers off," when I mentioned vacation, even though she knew I spent summers planning curriculum and working a second job. Or she'd sigh when I suggested we stay in and watch a movie, saying something about how she needed to be around ambitious people to stay motivated. I'm not an idiot. I knew what she meant. She was saying I wasn't ambitious. That my job wasn't real work compared to hers. That I was somehow less than her. Now, the thing is, I never wanted her corporate life. I loved teaching. I loved coming home at a reasonable hour. I loved having time to read and think and exist as a human being instead of a productivity machine. But somewhere along the way, my contentment became laziness in her eyes. My stability became stagnation. And my support became me holding her back from some imaginary destiny she'd invented. Her friends started changing, too. Suddenly, it was all people from her office, people who talked about quarterly earnings and disruption and synergy. I'd sit there at dinner parties feeling like I'd accidentally wandered into a TED Talk I didn't sign up for. Sarah stopped introducing me as her husband and started introducing me as, "This is Kev, he teaches," like it was some quirky hobby instead of my career. There was this one dinner party at her colleague's place that really drove it home. I was standing in the kitchen, holding a beer, while Sarah was in the living room talking about some campaign she'd launched. A guy in an expensive suit asked me what I did. When I said I taught high school history, he actually laughed like I'd made a joke. Then he realized I was serious and said, "Oh, that's nice. Someone's got to do it." Like teaching was community service instead of a real career. I looked over at Sarah to see if she'd heard. And she had. But she just kept talking. Didn't defend me. Didn't even acknowledge it. That's when I knew something had fundamentally shifted, because the Sarah I'd married would have shut that guy down immediately. Would have told him how important teachers were, how hard I worked. But this version of Sarah, this senior director version, she'd already mentally categorized me as someone who didn't need defending because I wasn't worth the social capital. I left that party early, told Sarah I had a headache, and she barely looked up from her conversation to say goodbye. About 6 months after the promotion, Sarah came home early on a Wednesday, which was unusual because she usually worked until 8 or 9. She asked if we could talk. She had this look on her face like she'd been practicing what to say, like she'd rehearsed this moment in her head, or maybe even with a therapist I didn't know she was seeing. We sat down at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten breakfast together 1,000 times, and she folded her hands like she was about to give a presentation. "I've been thinking a lot about us," she said. And I already knew where this was going, but I let her talk. "I think we've grown in different directions. I think we want different things now. I think I need to be with someone who matches my energy and my goals." She didn't say it meanly. That's what messed me up the most. She said it like she was explaining a business decision, like our marriage was an underperforming asset she needed to divest from. I asked her if there was someone else, and she looked almost offended, like I'd insulted her integrity. She said, "No, this wasn't about another person. This was about her needing to focus on herself and her career without feeling guilty about leaving me behind." I sat there for a minute, just processing. And I realized Sarah was waiting for me to fight for us, to beg, to promise I'd change, to get emotional and make this dramatic. But here's the thing. I'd been fighting for us for 2 years, quietly. By accepting her distance, by supporting her dreams, by making myself smaller so she could feel bigger. And I was exhausted. So instead of begging, instead of crying or arguing or trying to change her mind, I just looked at her and said, "If this is what you need to be happy, I won't stop you." She actually looked surprised, like she'd expected me to put up a fight. For just a second, I saw something flicker across her face. Maybe doubt, maybe disappointment that I wasn't going to give her the drama she'd mentally prepared for. But then it was gone. She nodded, professional again, and started talking about logistics. About how we'd split things. About how she'd already talked to a lawyer and could recommend one for me. I realized right then that Sarah hadn't come home to discuss whether we should divorce. She'd come home to inform me that we were divorcing, and she'd probably made this decision weeks, or even months, ago. The marriage was already over in her mind. I was just the last person to get the memo. The divorce took 3 months to finalize. Sarah thought that was way too long, and I thought it was incredibly fast for ending 8 years of marriage. She was generous about the split, and I say that without sarcasm. She let me keep the apartment because she was already moving into some luxury high-rise downtown that cost more per month than I made in 3. She took most of the furniture because it matched her new aesthetic or whatever, and I didn't fight her on any of it because honestly, I just wanted it to be over. The day she came to pick up the last of her stuff, she stood in the doorway for a second, looking around our empty apartment like she was trying to remember why she'd ever lived there. Then she left without saying goodbye. I stood there in the middle of all that empty space, surrounded by the echo of furniture that used to be there, and I waited to fall apart. I waited for the crushing weight of loneliness, for the panic, for the regret. But it didn't come. Instead, what I felt was this weird lightness, like I'd been holding my breath for 2 years, and finally, someone told me I could exhale. The first week after Sarah moved out was strange in ways I didn't expect. I kept waking up and forgetting she was gone, reaching for my phone to text her something funny that happened at school, before remembering she wouldn't care. But then, I'd make coffee in the quiet kitchen. No rush, no tension. Nobody sighing at me for using the wrong mug or taking too long. And I'd realize the apartment felt bigger without her in it. My friends from school kept checking on me, asking if I was okay, offering to take me out drinking or set me up with someone. And I appreciated it, but I didn't need it. What I needed was to figure out who I was without constantly measuring myself against Sarah's success. I started running in the mornings before school, not because I was trying to get fit or impress anyone, but because I needed to do something with all the nervous energy I'd been suppressing for years. At first, I could barely make it around the block without stopping, but I kept going. There was something satisfying about pushing my body until my brain shut up for a while. I won't pretend the first month was easy. There were nights I'd lie in bed and wonder if I'd made a mistake by not fighting harder. If I should have begged her to stay. If maybe I really was the problem. But then I'd remember how exhausted I felt during those last 2 years. How every conversation was like walking through a minefield. How I'd started censoring myself around her because I knew my life was too small for her now. I'd remember the feeling of shrinking, of apologizing for existing, of watching her look at me like I was something she'd outgrown. And I'd realize that fighting for that marriage would have just been fighting to feel inadequate for the rest of my life. Sarah had made me feel like my teaching job was a cute little hobby, like my contentment was weakness, like my support for her was really just me lacking ambition of my own. And the messed up thing is, I'd started to believe it. I'd started to think maybe she was right. Maybe I was holding her back just by being myself. 2 months after the divorce was final, I joined a local hiking group that one of my coworkers kept bugging me about. I figured it would be good to get out of the apartment on weekends instead of sitting around overthinking everything. And it turned out to be exactly what I needed. These people didn't care about corporate ladders or quarterly earnings. They just wanted to walk through nature and talk about normal human stuff, like books and music and what kind of trail mix was superior. I started sleeping better, eating better, even laughing at stupid jokes again without that voice in my head telling me I should be doing something more productive. One Saturday, I was cleaning out a drawer and found this old photo from our 3rd anniversary. Both of us laughing at some restaurant we couldn't really afford back then. And I just sat there staring at it, trying to remember when exactly we'd stopped laughing like that. The Sarah in that picture looked at me like I was her favorite person in the world. And I remembered feeling like I was the luckiest guy alive because this brilliant, ambitious woman had chosen me. I put the photo in a box with the rest of our stuff. Not because I was trying to erase her, but because I realized that version of us didn't exist anymore, and holding on to it was just holding on to pain. My coworker noticed I seemed different, lighter somehow, and asked if I was okay. I told him I was getting there, and the weird thing was, I actually meant it. I posted a few pictures on social media. Nothing dramatic, just me on a mountain trail or at a coffee shop with my hiking group. And I wasn't doing it to make Sarah jealous or prove anything. I was doing it because for the first time in years, I actually felt like I had a life worth documenting. That's when I started hearing things through mutual friends, little comments that Sarah had been asking about me. One of her old colleagues, who I was still friendly with, mentioned that Sarah had brought me up at some work event, asking if anyone had seen me lately, if I was doing okay. Another friend said Sarah had been checking my social media, which was weird because she barely looked at my posts when we were married. I didn't know what to make of it, and I tried not to think about it too much. But there was this small part of me that wondered what she was thinking. If she regretted leaving. If she'd expected me to fall apart and was confused that I hadn't. The old me would have reached out, would have asked if she wanted to talk, would have given her an opening to come back. But I didn't want to go back. Not to that version of myself that apologized for taking up space, not to that marriage where I was constantly trying to be enough for someone who decided I never would be. A month or so after the divorce was final, I ran into Sarah outside a coffee shop downtown. I was with 2 friends from my hiking group, still in workout clothes and probably looking like a mess. And she was in full business mode. Designer outfit, perfect hair, that confident stride that used to make me proud and now just made me tired. She stopped when she saw me, and for a second, neither of us knew what to say. "Kev," she said, and her voice was different. Softer. Maybe less certain. "You look good." "You've been working out." I told her, yeah, I'd taken up running and hiking, staying busy. And she nodded like she was processing information in a business meeting. She asked how I was doing, if teaching was going well. And the questions felt genuine, but also like she was fishing for something, like she wanted to hear that I was struggling or that I missed her. I told her I was doing really well, actually, better than I'd been in a long time. And I meant it. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes, and she looked at me like she was seeing a stranger. Like the person standing in front of her wasn't the same guy she'd left for months ago. We said goodbye, and she walked away. I watched her go with this weird feeling of closure, like I'd been waiting for that moment without realizing it. My friend asked if I was okay, and I said, yeah, I really was. And the truth of that statement hit me harder than the divorce papers ever did. 5 months after the divorce, I found out through a former coworker of Sarah's that she'd been asking about me regularly. Not just casual "how's he doing" questions, but specific stuff like where I was spending my weekends, if I was seeing anyone, if I seemed happy. The coworker thought it was funny, said Sarah had this look on her face like she couldn't quite figure out a puzzle. And I realized she'd been expecting a different outcome. She'd expected me to be devastated, to be calling her at midnight, begging for another chance, to be posting sad quotes on social media or letting myself go. Instead, I was thriving in this quiet, unspectacular way that probably drove her crazy because there was nothing for her to feel guilty about or superior to. I wasn't falling apart. I wasn't bitter. I was just living my life. And somehow that was more threatening to her than any amount of anger or heartbreak would have been. Around the 7-month mark, I met Chloe at a bookstore. I wasn't looking to date anyone. I was genuinely just browsing the history section because that's what I do on Saturday afternoons. And she made a comment about the book I was holding, something about how that particular author had an interesting take on the Revolutionary War. We ended up talking for 20 minutes right there in the aisle, and it was the easiest conversation I'd had with someone in years. Chloe was a librarian, one of those people who actually loved books instead of just posting pictures with them for aesthetic. And when she laughed at my terrible history jokes, I didn't feel like I was being humored. I felt like I was being seen. We exchanged numbers and started getting coffee, then dinner, then long walks where we talked about everything and nothing. She knew I was divorced and recently, and she didn't push for details or try to fix me. She just let me exist as I was. The difference between being with Chloe and being with Sarah was like the difference between breathing easy and holding your breath. I didn't realize how much tension I'd been carrying until I was around someone who didn't make me feel like I needed to apologize for existing. I didn't post about Chloe on social media right away because I wasn't trying to make a statement. But eventually, there were pictures of us at a museum, at a hiking trail, at this little Italian restaurant we'd found. I tagged her in a few of them. Nothing dramatic, just normal couple stuff. And apparently, that's when Sarah's curiosity turned into something else. A mutual friend told me Sarah had seen the pictures and spent 20 minutes asking questions about Chloe, what she did for work, how long we'd been together, if it was serious. The friend said Sarah had this look on her face like she'd just realized she'd miscalculated something important, like she bet on a stock dropping and instead it had doubled in value. I didn't take any satisfaction in that. Or maybe I took a little. I'm human, after all. But mostly I just felt sad for her, because I realized she'd expected me to wait, to stay stuck in that moment of rejection, to serve as proof that leaving me was the right decision. One evening, about 9 months post-divorce, I was at home grading papers when my phone rang from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Sarah. Her voice was different, less confident, more tentative, and she asked if we could talk. "I've been thinking about us a lot," she said, and I could hear something in her voice that sounded like regret. "I think maybe I made a mistake. I think maybe I was too focused on the wrong things. I think maybe we gave up too easily." I sat there listening, and 2 years ago, I would have jumped at this, would have said yes immediately. Would have been so grateful she was giving me another chance. But now, sitting in my quiet apartment with Chloe's scarf draped over the back of my chair and a stack of her book recommendations on my coffee table, I felt nothing but a deep, exhausting clarity. I asked Sarah what changed. She was quiet for a moment before saying something vague about perspective and realizing what mattered. But what I heard beneath that was, she'd expected me to be broken and I wasn't. She'd expected to feel relief and instead she felt loss. She'd expected moving on to be easy, and it wasn't. I told Sarah I appreciated her calling, but I'd moved on. That I was seeing someone and I was happy. There was this long silence on the other end. And then she asked if we could at least meet for coffee to talk about everything, to get closure. I said no, as gently as I could, explaining that I'd already gotten my closure. That I'd spent months working through everything, and I was finally in a good place. I thought you loved me, she said, and her voice cracked in a way I'd never heard before. I did love you, I told her. And it was true. I loved you for years. I loved you when you were studying until 3 in the morning. I loved you through every promotion and every late night and every moment you needed me to be strong. But you stopped loving me the moment you decided I wasn't ambitious enough. And I spent 2 years fighting for us silently while you were already planning your exit. She tried to say something, but I wasn't done. You didn't leave because we grew apart. You left because you decided my life was too small for you. And the truth is, I was fighting for our marriage every single day just by staying and supporting you. You just didn't see it as fighting because it wasn't loud or dramatic. After we hung up, I sat there for a while, just thinking about how different I felt from the guy who'd sat at that kitchen table 9 months ago, listening to her end our marriage. That guy had felt small and insufficient and like he'd somehow failed at being enough. This guy knew the truth, that the problem was never my job or my ambitions or my contentment. The problem was that Sarah had stopped seeing me as a partner and started seeing me as a limitation. I thought about all those years I'd made myself smaller to make room for her success. How I'd swallowed my hurt when she diminished my career. How I'd smiled through dinner parties where I felt invisible. I'd been fighting for us the whole time. I'd just been fighting in a way she didn't recognize because she measured worth in promotions and salary and status instead of in quiet support and consistent presence. Chloe came over later that night and found me sitting on the couch staring at nothing. I told her about Sarah's call, and she just sat next to me, not trying to fix it or analyze it, just being there. You okay? She asked, and I realized I genuinely was. She didn't ask a million questions or try to analyze Sarah's motives. She just held my hand and let me process. After a while, she said, "You know what I love about you?" And I said, "What?" And she said, "You're so steady. Like, you know who you are, and you're not apologizing for it." It hit me that this was exactly what Sarah had hated about me. My steadiness, my contentment, my lack of hunger for more. But Chloe saw those same qualities and loved them. And that's when I really understood that the problem was never me. It was just that I'd been trying to be enough for someone who didn't want what I had to offer. Chloe wanted a partner who came home at reasonable hours and talked about books and didn't measure worth in dollar signs. And I was that person. I'd always been that person. I'd just spent years being made to feel like that person wasn't enough. Sarah had left thinking I'd crumble, that I'd realize how much I needed her, that I'd come crawling back. Instead, I'd discovered who I was without her expectations crushing me. I'd found someone who loved me for being exactly who I was. And I'd learned that sometimes the quietest people are fighting the hardest battles. I wasn't angry at Sarah anymore. I wasn't even sad. I just hoped she'd eventually find what she was looking for because clearly, it wasn't me. And honestly, I wasn't her either. She thought she was trading up when she left, but what she was really doing was trading away someone who'd loved her unconditionally for the chance to be with someone who matched her resume. And I hope that works out for her. I genuinely do. As for me, I was exactly where I needed to be. Finally breathing easy, finally taking up space without apologizing, finally understanding that being enough for the wrong person means nothing compared to being yourself with the right one. What do you think was the biggest misunderstanding in our relationship?